Welcome back to Scotomaville. This is Volume 3, Episode 2, on pace and sequence. It's March. We're airstreaming, it's still snowing. Perfect example of the Murphys and spuds and curves that make their way into your production pace. Let's encapsulate by looking back quickly at Scotomaville as a trilogy. Volume 1 is on escaping tyranny. It's about gaining awareness that you are enslaved to your own bad thinking, and that awareness can help you flee to your desert.
Aha of where you're wrong in order to sharpen your sword.
By watching my errors, you can learn what not to step on and gain some understanding to cross your own deserts.
And the desert is this process of releasing the grumbling, giving way to the process, and gaining understanding.
That's Volume 2. And in Volume 3, we're dealing with the discipline of self-authoring. Let me show you a few things that I've been digging up this last few weeks.
If you're looking to facilitate people's ability to make positive changes in their own life, there is nothing you can do that's more helpful to that than to make them literate. And if you want to help them understand who they are in the deepest sense, over and above the superficial attractions of tribalism, let's say, you have to educate them deeply in this historical realm that requires the acquisition of explicit knowledge about the central nature of the human being.
The pace that you take for production is determined by a bunch of different factors. Some of it's the weather. Much of it has to do with the events of your expedition as they come along. And specifically, it has to do with how fast you can become aware and gain understanding, that's learning, or by mimicking what you're seeing me doing.
When I think about setting a pace for something, I remember Jim Rohn, that life expects measurable results in a reasonable amount of time. That's why they make those 5th grade chairs so small.
And a great deal has to do with the position you take, leaning forward to the future self, self-authoring, imagining what your character would be in the future. And by doing so, being able to create the dopamine, the feel-good sensation, without the addictions and without being frozen. So actually getting yourself to take that action, go out into some snow, into something uncomfortable, something that's not of your usual pattern. Step out of that purposefully.
Ideally, we simply imagine an outcome, cut up the time available into equal increments, and go about the work. But unfortunately, that's not how it usually pans out. A reasonable pace, which would be the number of episodes over the amount of time. And you might expect to get a great number of episodes done in a reasonable amount of time. Well, let me share with you some of the things that disrupt that. One of those that you can't control much are the macro events. And those tend to be things like political events, the economy, and financial events, the life phase that you happen to be in, the historic events like the pandemic, etc. And then there are circumstances that we find ourselves in. Oops. And those circumstances can be things like the market, if you are an entrepreneur or self-employed, the weather, the roles that you play and the needs that you have to be responsible for, and then the timing, how this interplays with other people. And then finally, the one that you have the most control over, and that is effort and attitude. In starting out, you're going to have a certain amount of skills to either that you already have them, or you're going to need to gain them both in creative and in technical production and in storytelling. And you have your mood that you can control through future self and self-talk and those sorts of things, and growing dendrites, because you're going to discover along the way a number of other wounds. Many of these things you have no control over. Yeah, you might adjust the timing for the weather slightly. You may try to reserve this personal Everest for the phase that you happen to be in. But in most cases, you're going to start out with a known quantity of skills and have to acquire skill sets through new learning. And you have an established number of wounds. So until you know exactly how much this is and which ones of these you don't have, the main thing that you can control is your mood, and that comes about through your dopamine production, which is a complex little system. What does your real pace look like? More like this. You may be able to crawl up to discover, oh no, you have to go down and across and back up and back down. And so your expectations are for this, but the reality is you have all of these different factors that will emerge over time, and that is a more realistic expectation for establishing your pace. You may write some quick notes and try but fail to crinkle the paper, and then not quite get it right a second time, and then the third time and fourth time, and see all the number of takes. You have to add that into your expectations of your pace. There's simply too many variables. You want to go out for a ride when the weather is good, but you don't have any control of it. Dendrite growth seems to be one of the largest determinants. Like, how quickly can you learn something to go from awareness of tyranny to an understanding of the way across the desert, and grow the dendrites and change the beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors. All of that is dependent upon how quickly you learn and transform your thinking.
One of my best known piece of work called the Mandelbrot set. It's a set which the formula is so short that people would think it's ridiculous. It's almost as simple as the formula of a circle. Formula can be very simple and create a universe of bottomless complexity. Amazing wealth of detail which is present there. It's just wonderful.
This is an example of the unfolding nature of awareness and understanding, just like a fractal. The Fiat 500 has been the cover of the book for almost 4 years, and I just found this fact about a Fiat. You might think a Fiat is just an Italian car, right? It's actually means a legal authoritative decision that has absolute sanction. It can gain an almost biblical aura of authority, like a movie pharaoh saying, "So let it be written, so let it be done. So let it be a Fiat." I think that's really funny. Here I am 4 years into using the Fiat as an analogy of being underpowered, and it's got a double meaning. That makes for a good segue to sequencing dopamine. You should sequence your clips for your own dendrite growth. Don't worry about how they stitch together for someone else's viewing. Consider how you want to record your learning process and your footsteps. They may not be exactly the best footholds for someone else to climb, but they will be perfect for your review.
An animal that doesn't have a lot of behavioral flexibility, generally its reproduction strategy is multiple copies of itself, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands. And the reason for that is all the variability in the animal's behavior is genetically coded. And so for it to adapt to the transforming horizon of the future, it has to produce multiple variants of itself, most of which die. With mosquitoes, for example, they produce thousands of eggs. And if they all lived, we'd be knee deep in mosquitoes in like 10 years. But they almost all of them die because they're not matched to the transformation that's coming down the pipeline. But with human beings, what we seem to have done is evolved a mechanism for manufacturing artificial selves in this game-like manner. And so we can put forward optional selves in abstraction and then kill them off when they're not necessary without us dying. And so the famous quote, I think it was Alfred North Whitehead, was that the purpose of thought was to let our thoughts die instead of us.
I love that.
And it really makes us unique. Yeah, it's great. It's absolutely great. And so, and then it seems to me too, you tell me what you think about this, is that the abstracted artificial selves, avatars in some sense, that the prefrontal cortex generates, I think when we describe those, we're telling stories. When we describe one of these alternative modes of action, that's precisely it. It's the verbal description of that is a story.
That's right. And you make a very important point, which is that the prefrontal cortex is a rule-changing, alternate self-accessing machine that can also calm the body. And imagining different selves and different outcomes almost requires that we suppress how we feel in our body in the moment. I guess we can look to some of our podcasting colleagues like the Jocko Willinks or the David Goggins, who are either forcing themselves or are somehow up at 4:30 in the morning and training, pushing through that, what I call limbic friction. The limbic system is saying, I'm tired or I'm anxious, and going against that. So there's literally there's a required suppression of the bodily response in order to imagine how we would feel when we complete this.
So, for example, if you're responding to something in an irritable way that's being directed to you on Twitter, there's going to be a limbic rage response that's associated with that, which you can then suppress. But then the question there that's quite complex, I would say, is something like, to what degree do you think you're directly suppressing that with the prefrontal cortex? And to what degree do you think you're spinning up an alternative self that, if embodied, wouldn't require that physiological response? And so you're switching to a new identity in which that limbic response is no longer germane.
Yeah.
And so the reason that it disappears is not because you directly suppress it in an inhibitory manner, but because you replace what's necessary physiologically given your new understanding of the territory that you inhabit.
What we know is that the prefrontal cortex and its associated networks contain a near infinite, if not infinite, set of possibilities, right? I mean, of course, it's bottlenecked by experience and it's bottlenecked by one's imagination. But, the number of different possible selves that one could imagine is near infinite if one were to spend time on it. Whereas the number of different bodily states that one can have are actually very finite. We can either be back on our heels, meaning retreating, or we can be flat-footed, sort of calm in our stance, or we can be forward center of mass. We can be in sort of pursuit and or competition. There really aren't other motor responses for an animal, including humans, right? You can either stay put,
right,
back up, or go forward. People who are willing to lean into that challenge.
Yeah.
The insula took on essentially a change in its activity patterns, this gamma pattern. The heart rate increased, breathing increased, sweating increased. So these are all the marks of an anxiety attack. But here, if you were to just look at the behavior of the person or the animal, what you'd find is that they were marching forward toward their fear. This is and so then...
That's voluntary exploration.
Right. The prefrontal cortex is actually part of the dopamine reward system because, as you pointed out before, it is generating possible outcomes, different rules, different selves are being projected into the future. That we have basically one major reward system, which is the dopaminergic system. I sometimes like the analogy that, nowadays you hear about cryptocurrency or the dollar versus the euro versus the this versus the that. There's only one currency in all of reality, actually, and it's dopamine. Whether or not it's the dollar backed to dopamine or it's euro backed to dopamine or Bitcoin backed dopamine. In the end, whether or not someone has $1 billion or $2 is really that currency resides as something that's transacted in the real world, but their notion of power and potential is dopaminergic. And so too, the potential for mates, the potential for food, how much food you have, how much meat you have stored in the freezer tells you a lot about your security and well-being for you and your family, right? And that is translated into a dopaminergic internal representation of how safe and secure you are. Key thing with dopamine, I think, that encapsulates the most of it is this notion of reward prediction error, which is very simple. If you are excited and anticipating something, you are generating some internal sense of the probability of it happening. We're going to the ice cream store, kids. Let's go. We're going to have ice cream. We have ice cream. It's closed. The disappointment that they experience actually brings them far lower than they would feel, much more sad than they would feel than had you not told them you were going to get ice cream, which speaks exactly to what you were saying, that it's an anticipation signal. So dopamine's going up, 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 we're going to get ice cream, and then no. So it drops below baseline. They would have been better off being not told they were going to the ice cream store. Just drive right by it.
The danger of hope.
The danger of hope.
So imagine what it does is backtrack the neural systems that were activated as the reward was approached. So then it feeds back reinforcement, not reward, but mediates cellular growth and maybe myelinization. It's increasing the efficiency of the neural connections of the systems that were activated just prior to receiving that reward in the order they were prioritized,
That's right.
in the order they were manifested. So the closer the behavior is to the receipt of the reward, the more it's reinforced and more likely to be manifested in the future. You want to make it as local and precise as you possibly can. So, and that's also one of the advantages to removing yourself from a rage or an anxiety state, because a rage or an anxiety state is low resolution and global. And so it'll be globally accusatory. And so you want to specify it and think, okay, well, what's the minimum necessary behavioral transformation to ensure that similar mistakes are not replicated in the future? And generally that doesn't require it's like if your roof leaks, you don't have to dig a new foundation. You can just fix a few shingles. And you might think, well, the rain's coming through, so you have to tear down the whole house. It's like, well, no, you have to. And you might panic and run around because the water's coming in, but it's still a bad idea to dig up the foundations every time something trivial maintenance problem needs to emerge. And so one of the things that's very useful to learn is is this only a trivial maintenance problem? And one of the advantages to that too is that if it's not the collapse of your entire self, let's say, and it's a trivial maintenance problem, you're much more able to activate that courageous response to anomaly that's part and parcel of exploratory behavior and eventual success. How do you tell yourself a story, like a real story, though, a story that actually works, that's most likely to put yourself in a position where you can confidently approach the thing that's blocking your path?
I can imagine that certain people might overinflate their wins.
Manics
overinflate. Well, there it is.
You bet. So, well,
the dopamine system.
Yeah, well, for a manic, every possible self is wonderful simultaneously. And so they're completely fragmented, right? Because every possibility is 100% dopaminergically, giving them a dopaminergic kick. And so it's complete positive emotion catastrophe on the manic side. So these systems, they have to exist in such tight balance, right? Because all of your potential positive selves are not to be regarded with exceptional enthusiasm. That's a form of pathology, even though, like, people don't like being treated for mania often, because especially going into a manic state is very enjoyable because it is associated with enthusiasm. And that's all dopamine-mediated positive emotion.
Let me put words to what you're seeing happen. I'm taking incremental steps. I'm showing you that I have a solid why in episode 1. In episode 2, I'm roped up, learning from others that have gone before me. And I'm presenting you with new ideas, concepts, words, making you literate and helping you to see what I'm learning about the plight of humanity. Let's close this up with actionable steps.
The point is, your best strategic position is, how am I insufficient and how can I rectify that? That's what you've got. And the thing is, you are insufficient and you could rectify it. Both of those are within your grasp if you aim low enough. And one of the things
why do you see that? That's another thing you keep saying, aim low enough, have a low enough bar. Why do you mean that?
Well, let's say you've got a kid and you want the kid to improve. You don't set them a bar that's so high that it's impossible for them to attain it. You take a look at the kid and you think, okay, this kid's got this range of skill. Here's a challenge we can throw at him or her that exceeds their current level of skill, but gives them a reasonable probability of success. And so, like, I'm saying it tongue-in-cheek to some degree, you know, it's like, but I'm doing it as an aid to humility. It's like, well, I don't know how to start improving my life. Someone might say that. And I would say, well, you're not aiming low enough. There's something you could do that you are regarding as trivial, that you could do, that you would do, that would result in an actual improvement. But it's not a big enough improvement for you, so you won't lower yourself enough to take the opportunity.
Incremental steps.
Yes.
So this is also what is achieved through exercise.
There's a humility in determining what it is that the wretched creature that you are can actually manage. Aim low. And I don't mean don't aim, and I don't mean don't aim up. But you have to accept the fact that you can set yourself a goal that you can attain, and there's not going to be much glory in it to begin with. Because if you're not in very good shape, the goal that you could attain tomorrow isn't very glorious. But it's a hell of a lot better than nothing, and it beats the hell out of bitterness, and it's way better than blaming someone else. It's way less dangerous. And you could do it. And what's cool about it, there's a statement in the New Testament. It's called the Matthew Principle, and economists use it to describe how the economy in the world works. To those who have everything, more will be given. From those who have nothing, everything will be taken. It's like what's very pessimistic in some sense, because it means that as you start to fail, you fail more and more rapidly. But it also means that as you start to succeed, you succeed more and more rapidly. And so you take an incremental step, and, well, now you can lift 55 pounds instead of 52.5 pounds. You think, well, what the hell's that? It's like, it's one step on a very long journey. And so it starts to compound on you. So a small step today puts you in a position to take a slightly bigger step the next day. And then that puts you in a position to take a slightly bigger step the next day. And you do that for 2 or 3 years, man, you're starting to stride.
in order to compile this all into something I think is meaningful for me to look back on in the future, and for my kids and grandkids to understand the journey that I had, and for my avatar to be able to mimic me, I've needed to grow dendrites and to think about the process of transformation and to observe my own behavior, and then to get the heck out of my desert and reinforce this learning by sharing with others and with you. You see how complicated that all is? Well, it's a sequence, but you can cut it all up. It's for you. It's for your transformation, not necessarily for your audience's entertainment or for the clicks that you're going to get, but certainly it's for your value in looking back from the future at who you were in the past. Yeah. And certainly it's for getting your butt the heck out of Scotomaville. All right. See you next episode.